Go. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions have been put on hold for a bit, I figured I would bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster. Intriguing interviews with creative minds. With us tonight is my pal, the award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of 36 novels of science fiction, fantasy, and adventure, including Star Trek Destinies and Cold Equations trilogies. His writing credits also span several media, including TV, short fiction, and comic books. Dave presently works as a consultant on 2 animated Star Trek TV shows, Lower Decks for CBS All Access and Star Trek Prodigy for Nickelodeon. Hello, Dave. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, glad to have you. And for everyone who is in the who's watching tonight, if you have questions for Dave or questions you want me to ask Dave, just send them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the show. All right, Dave, we're going to start at the beginning as we always do. So where were you born and where'd you grow up?
Well, I don't like to tell people where I was born, but I'll tell you I grew up in East Hampton, Massachusetts. It's a little town off I-91 that most people pass by at high velocity on their way to Vermont.
So what was it like for you? Is it just you, brothers, sisters, or what was that like back then?
I grew up with an older brother.
Okay.
He went away to the Navy when I was only 9, so most of my important formative tween years were spent alone. I had a couple of stepsisters who I rarely, if ever, saw, maybe sometimes during a summer vacation or something like that.
Okay.
But for the most part, it was a quiet, very solitary childhood and adolescent existence.
So your brother who's in the Navy, what's the age difference between you guys?
About 8.5 years.
8.5 years. Okay. So it was a little bit too much of sort of, you couldn't really connect it wasn't a peer-to-peer level.
We weren't peers. He was more of a surrogate, almost pseudo-parent when I was a kid.
Right.
And it changed, of course, once he got back from the service. He was starting college after 6 years of naval service. And at one point, he and I were both working as cooks in the same Friendly's restaurant. So me and my older brother at one point got to work together in the kitchen of a Friendly's restaurant. So that was kind of fun.
Was this before or after he was in the Navy?
After his discharge.
So he was in the Navy, came back, and he was a cook at Friendly's.
Well, while he was going to college to get
in a transitional period. Wow.
It was in a transitional period. He came out of the Navy with an associate's degree of some kind, mathematics, I believe.
Okay.
But he wanted a bachelor's degree in engineering, and so he entered college, and just to pick up a little extra money while he was going to school, he happened to get on the cook line with me. So at one point,
you were
basically the brothers were running the grill at one point.
Ooh, the Mack brothers behind the grill. So what, you were a teenager around then?
Yeah, I would have been about 16, 17.
16, okay. So you were obviously, you're a sci-fi fantasy guy. When you were a kid, was that always kind of was that a core part of your childhood, or did you kind of come to that later?
I grew up with Star Trek, the original series, in syndicated reruns. I remember watching it even as a little kid. I imprinted upon Star Trek the way a duckling imprints on the first moving thing it sees. So for me, it was Kirk, it was Spock, it was McCoy and Scotty and the Enterprise. From a science fictional standpoint, the original series will always be my first love. So
just going back to your brother for a minute. So when he, having been even in the Navy and a lot of Star Trek, they use kind of a lot of naval references.
Oh yeah.
Did you guys bond over that at all when you were on the cook line? Was that something you guys?
Not really. He wasn't a big Star Trek fan, but we did use a lot of naval references once we were on the cook line, mostly because he couldn't help himself and it amused the heck out of me. So we would eventually come to refer to the customers as the enemy, incoming food orders as incoming shells, incoming fire. We would treat the whole thing like a military exercise, damage control. It was just a ridiculous way of coping with an otherwise pointless and stupid job.
So you were into Star Trek from the get-go. Was it just Star Trek for you? Was it all kind of like sci-fi, fantasy, comic books, or was just Star Trek was that really your jam?
What are you talking about when I was a kid, like when I was a teenager? Yeah. For me, Star Trek is what started it, but I was generally interested in science fiction, in fantasy. Even as a young kid, I was enjoying works of original SF. I think the first original SF novel I ever read was something called The Space Eagle. And it had something to do with a space agent who is trying to stop a third party from starting a nuclear war, because the third party is trying to trick the United States into believing that the Soviets would launch a nuclear attack on Christmas Day. And so it's some sort of a weird science fictional thriller. All I really remember are the bare bones of the plot and the title, but the picture of the spaceman with his helmet and his cool rocket ship in this little hardcover edition that I checked out of my public library. I remember reading that book when sitting in a stairwell at my mom's work, you know, because to get me out of the way, because we had no babysitter, she would take me to work and stick me in the stairwell, and I would sit there with my book. And I remember reading that book. And I remember reading Pierre Boulle's original novel version of Planet of the Apes, even before I saw the movie.
Right.
I remember growing up with Buck Rogers in the 25th Century.
For sure.
So I loved Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon type stuff.
Yeah.
The only other thing that sort of competed for my attention at that point was Charlie Brown. I love the Charlie Brown comics.
Yes. Interesting. So Star Trek and Charlie Brown. So let me ask you, so what was it about, since Star Trek is such a core part of your life and has been throughout, what was it do you think, or I don't know if you've thought about it on this level, but what was it for you about Star Trek in particular that resonated with you then, that's been able to carry through, you know, all these years? I mean, I'm a Star Trek, I'm a Kirk, Spock, McCoy guy myself. What was it for you that kind of that you connected with it most?
Well, I mean, growing up, I always found it a little hard to relate to other kids because I was always in like the special talented gifted program or whatever, in like, you know, group whatever, which was the kids who read above grade level. And I found Star Trek to be very reassuring because it was a story about exceptional people who traveled the galaxy with their friends, getting into cool adventures and learning about nifty things. And it was a series whose core message was, it is better to have peace than to make war. It is better to find a peaceful solution of compromise than it is to defeat somebody through force of arms. It's better to make a friend than an enemy. And these were all things that resonated very strongly with me, but especially the notion of just a meritocracy in which we get along, we reward and value intelligence and difference and integrity. And these were things that resonated very strongly for me on a very fundamental level. And so even as I got older and I marveled at the spectacle of Star Wars starting in 77, when, you know, my dad took me to see that, and then other movies, and I got into, like, you know, like most kids my age did, got into the nihilism of Mad Max and The Road Warrior in the early 80s, and so on and so forth, Terminator.
Yep.
Even with all of that, because I had imprinted from the very beginning on Star Trek, nothing has ever supplanted the emotional connection I make with that vision of hope and optimism.
Oh, right on. So let me ask you something. So was it just kind of, because I know a little bit, some of the things you just mentioned, you know, Terminator, Mad Max, all that kind of stuff, which has a much more of a kind of like a visceral kind of component to it. Was it just science fiction fantasy for you, or was it also like action, adventure, espionage?
Oh, of course. I love James Bond, action adventure. As I got older, got into college, you know, stuff like 24 finally came out. I love 24. But I always loved the James Bond movies, action movies in general.
Yep.
But science fiction, fantasy, Lord of the Rings, silly fantasy movies, well, not always silly. Classic example, Conan the Barbarian. The one, you know, with the script partly written by Oliver Stone, directed by John Milius.
Yep.
The original Conan the Barbarian, it gets a bad rap. People treat it like it's just yet another sword and sorcery picture, but it's actually operating on a number of levels. It's far better than people think it is.
I haven't seen it in a long. That's the Schwarzenegger one, right?
The original Schwarzenegger film.
I remember it being pretty good, actually.
The sequel was not very good, but the original was excellent.
Yep.
I mean, the iconic moment of Conan cutting his own chains. Beautiful symbolic moment.
Absolutely.
Like the scene where he's being chased and cornered by wolves, and we dissolve to that connection after he's cut his own chains after finding the Atlantean sword. And the next time we see him, he's wearing wolf skins. It's a nice little touch. And the whole movie is full of those smart little moments.
So,
So fantasy also was very important to me from a very young age.
So tell me about, so you obviously were always, you were a voracious reader and consumer of sci-fi, fantasy. So when did you first get serious about the writing part of it? Was that something that came later? Was it always as a kid? Like, what's the beginning for you?
I remember being a kid of about, say, 10 years old and daydreaming about seeing my name on a book cover someday, about writing a novel and being the author. I wanted to be an author. And I sort of took a detour around the age of 14, 15 into screenwriting. And that's a whole very long story that we don't have time for. But the shortened version is I sort of proved my interest in it. I ended up taking a course at a local community college when I was only a sophomore in high school.
Right.
I aced that class in screenwriting.
Right.
And because of that, I was able to sort of persuade my folks that I was serious about this. That screenwriting class was fundamental in how I got into NYU film school. I did film school. I learned script writing. I learned TV production. And I pursued TV writing pretty aggressively through my 20s with not much success. Had a brief moment of breakthrough with Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager in 1995. I thought it would lead to bigger and better things, and it didn't. And then after a few more years of tilting at film and television windmills and getting nowhere, I shifted gears around the year 2000 after I'd done a comic book script, and I got interested in prose writing, something that friends had been telling me for some time that I should look into. And I finally took the plunge, and I signed my first book contract in May of 2000, and I started getting published around 2001, 2002, and never looked back. And prose writing has been very good to me since then.
And I mean, you've written so many books at this point, especially over the time frame that we're talking about. Do you still have an appetite now? I mean, if the opportunities were there, do you want to do script writing again, or have?
Absolutely.
Yep.
I would go back in a heartbeat if I were offered a chance to pen an episode of one of the animated shows for which I consult, or if I got a chance to start at the bottom rung as a staff writer in a show like Discovery or Picard or one of the new shows, such as Section 31 or Strange New Worlds. Be there in a heartbeat. I'm incorporated. I'm ready to go. I'm registered to do business in California. Wink, wink.
Wink, wink.
And I can be out there and in a room in as little as 10 days. So just saying.
Just saying.
Yeah, just saying. Yeah, I mean, I would still like to make it happen. And there's always the dream that some original work of mine will sell on its own merits, become a TV series, or that a standalone work might someday become a novel, or excuse me, a movie.
Right.
So, yes, mostly because the money is very good, but also because it is still an art form that I enjoy. I've written some spec scripts that have adapted my own work, and I found that to be an enjoyable process. So yeah, it's still something I would love to do.
So just sticking on the script moment for just for a minute, did you find that, so you spent, in your formative years and spent quite a bit of time, learning the craft of script writing. Have you found that training and that discipline has helped you as a novelist?
Some of it has, and at the very least, it got me into the practice of producing daily pages. It got me thinking about story structure. Many of the practices that I learned as a young screenwriter, which are fundamental to the pursuit of screenwriting and TV writing, prepared me well for media tie-in work. For instance, in screenwriting, they tell you structure is everything. So one of the things most screenwriters are taught to do at the beginning is outline your scripts, make beat sheets, detailed story outlines, treatments. You're taught all of this type of stuff. That's really useful if you go into media tie-in writing, such as writing books for Star Trek or Star Wars or Marvel, because when you propose the story to the editor and the licensor, they need to see a detailed outline so that they can approve the story concept and the general content of the work before the manuscript is written. Right. When you're writing an original novel, you don't have to go through all that. But because at this point I had spent 20 years or so training myself to work that way, thinking in terms of outlines and structure and plotting my work out before I begin, that's just how I work now. So it imparted to me a set of skills which I have carried forward. Obviously, the content of screenwriting and prose writing is very different. The approach is very different. But the fundamental tools for preparing to write, for learning to think about story that I picked up from my training in screenwriting were completely portable to my work as a novelist.
Right. So we started off talking about, how you kind of found this love, as so many of us do, for science fiction and fantasy adventure. Mm-hmm. And you write a combination of these things. Sometimes mm-hmm. it's more sci-fi, sometimes more fantasy, sometimes it cross-pollinate. Do you prefer, as an author, do you prefer sci-fi over fantasy, the reverse, or you just kind of go, the story takes you where it takes you?
I go with where the inspiration goes. I think part of the reason I have veered toward fantasy in my original works over the past several years is that much of my other work has been rooted in science fiction media tie-in, mostly Star Trek, but with a few other exceptions. And I think that I just wanted to do something that was markedly different from the type of work I was already doing for Star Trek. I wanted to show that there was, that I had a sense of range, that I could do something other than, fire phasers, fire torpedoes, something more than just space opera. I was also worried that if I tried to do space opera or space adventure of a non-Star Trek variety, that I might end up just creating something that feels like Star Trek with the serial numbers filed off. Right. Some writers are better at, divorcing themselves mentally from what they've done before and starting with a blank slate. I found that easier to do in a fantasy concept. That said, the story that I'm working on now, I'm working on a new original idea that I've been tinkering with for several months. It's a hard SF idea, no fantasy elements at all. Right. It was just a matter of I had not been inspired on that front before, but now that I've had the idea, I have to pursue it.
So this is something I've been wanting to ask you for a long time. So your books are known for their intensity and your almost ruthless insistence on killing your darlings. Is the presence or threat of death critical in your writing, or just an extension of the stories that you tell?
I think it's just a fundamental element of the type of stories I like to tell. I like thrillers. I like a sense of momentum. I like high stakes. That said, not every story I've written has to have life or death stakes, or if it does, I haven't always taken the side of kill everybody and let the reader sort them out. I've deliberately flouted that convention on a number of occasions and written stories with happy endings where nonviolence was found, where a way was found to resolve the situation without everybody ending up in a pile of blood. That said, I've also written my share of stories that are soaked in blood, and I apologize for nothing.
Apologize for nothing. There's also a heavy, not in all of your work, but there's a heavy espionage tenor to your work. What is it about the kind of larger socio-political threads that appeal to you as a writer?
I guess there's always a thread for me in whatever I'm working of the individual striving against the machine, striving against a bureaucratic or autocratic institution. Right. The sense that there's something large and oppressive. There is a system that we rail against. And I often think of it as the role of the hero, the obligation of the hero to be the one who stands up on the behalf of others to take on the impossible fight, to be the David who fights the Goliath. And I find something very compelling in the notion of the wily trickster or the resourceful, rogue, the James Bond type, who can be the one man who takes on an organization, the one man who can fight an army. I've always found that very compelling. Again, probably because I grew up watching James Bond, right, but also because I grew up watching Bugs Bunny. I love the trickster. I love the underdog. Best, right? Yep. Of course, as much as I aspire to be Bugs Bunny, I am confronted every day by the horrible truth that I'm really just Daffy Duck, the embodiment of envy, seething, raging envy.
Yes.
I want to be Bugs, but I know I'm probably Daffy.
Yeah, Eni is stinker. Hey, for everyone who came in a little bit late, if you have any questions or comments for Dave, send them in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the show. All right, Dave. So you've got a new book, The Shadow Commission, the third entry in your Dark Arts series. So tell me about the series. Like, what's the premise? What was your inspiration behind it?
The premise behind Dark Arts is a secret history, contemporary fantasy set during the mid-20th century. The idea is that black magic is real, ceremonial black magic as described in Renaissance-era texts, say stuff of about the 15th century. We're talking about works like the Clavicula Salomonis Regis, the Lemageten, I believe it's also known as, Pseudomonarchia Demonium. The idea that all magic is derived through the summoning and control of demons, or in some rare cases, angels. And the difference between those two forms of magic, demonic magic is known as Gerdic magic, and angelic magic is known as Pauline magic, or the Pauline rites versus the Gerdic rites. And so I've got this sort of notion from a novel called Black Easter by James Blish, published back in 1968, about a year before I was born. And it's a very different kind of novel than anything I would write. His is very talky, it's very philosophical, very introspective. But the one aspect of it that always haunted me was this notion of the system of magic. What if demonic-based magic were real? What if it actually functioned the way the old grimoires say it does? So I took that idea and I made it a touch more cinematic. With help from Aaron Rosenberg, fellow author and a good friend of mine, good friend of yours, came up with the notion of yoking, the concept of a magician taking a demon, and instead of the demon possessing the magician seizes control of the demon, holds it within themselves on purpose. And as long as they're able to hold it under their power, they can wield the demon's special powers as if those powers were their own. So if you can hold a fire demon and take the pain and misery that comes with doing so, suddenly you can throw fireballs and light fires and make things explode. But there's a cost to it. It's miserable. It causes headaches, indigestion, nightmares, OCD, and a host of other disorders. But so to deal with this, magicians drink heavily and take heroin and do other crazy self-medicating things. And then I extrapolated from this, and I was looking for the most dramatic sort of way to approach the material. My original idea was going to be a cyberpunk near future thing. So it was going to be near future, pseudo SF with this weird dark fantasy element. But I kept getting bogged down in the backstory of the villain, which harkened all the way back to World War II. And after struggling with that for about 6 months, I realized at some point that World War II was actually the novel I wanted to write.
Right, yes.
That's the story I wanted to tell. And I just stopped fighting it, and I gave into it, and it became...
You mean this one?
Yes, The Midnight Front is the first book in the Dark Arts series. And that's essentially a 6-year war epic of the war in Europe, with the Nazis having a black magician and his acolytes on their side. So the Allies decide we need to get some of those for ourselves. And they create the Midnight Front, the Allies' top secret black magic warfare unit, into which our hero is recruited after the bad guys kill his parents. He goes in wanting revenge. Eventually he learns that the war is bigger than him or his petty needs, and that heroism is not about revenge, it is about sacrifice. And then the series continues with the Iron Codex. That goes and jumps forward into 1954, and it's a Cold War spy thriller. So I wanted each book in the series to be a different kind of book. If book one is a war epic, book two is a John le Carré, Ian Fleming style James Bond spy thriller with black magic. Right. And now book three, The Shadow Commission, is basically like 3 days of the Condor with black magic. So the notion is that Kennedy has just been shot, and now somebody is coming to assassinate the last of the world's free renegade sorcerers. And they have to figure out who it is and how it connects to Kennedy before they all get killed.
Whoa. So, all right, I'm hooked, sold. So, now, that was
all
great.
My sales were so easy.
Yes. That's what they all say, right? So, you know what time it is. As we always do on the show, it is time for Spin the wheel. So on the wheel are 7 categories, and these categories I created especially for you for today. And these categories include red shirts, Bath of Con, Shaken Not Stirred, Beam Me Up Scotty, the Soup Nazi, Crew Stew, and Roll the Bones, denote the double meaning of bones. All right.
So all that stuff you sent me as prep was just a misdirection.
Absolutely. Yes. So
you were messing with me.
Well, we're updated. So we're going to spin the wheel, and what you get is what you play. You ready to go? Here we go.
No, but let's just do it.
All right, here we go. So we got, all right, the Soup Nazi. All right, so being a big fan of Seinfeld as you are, and as am I, the Soup Nazi is one of the greatest side characters to ever pop up. Now, if you could pick one character from Seinfeld, and it can't be the Soup Nazi, to write into your next Star Trek book, who would that be?
Oh, damn. Maybe Babu Bhat?
You're a very bad man.
You're a very bad man, James Kirk. You're a very bad man. You destroy my restaurant. You violate Prime Directive. You're a very, very bad man.
Very bad. Very bad.
Very bad man.
All right. I love it. I love it. All right.
Take your stupid starship and just go.
And go. And go. Very bad.
Very, very bad man.
Very bad man. Okay. So I've been threatening to do this for many shows, and now we're going to do it. You ready? We're going to do 2 lies and a truth.
All right.
Before the show began, I asked you to come up with 2 lies and a truth. You give me your statements, and I'll try to sniff out the truth. Lay them on.
Right.
Lay them on.
All right. So, in order. I once spent 8 hours in jail for punching a cow. That's statement number 1.
I can't believe
Statement number 2. I once destroyed a Mercedes with a water balloon. Statement number 3. Both of my first 2 answers were lies.
See, I could see you doing either of those things.
That's the dilemma, isn't it?
I'm gonna go with number 2, that you destroyed the Mercedes with a water balloon.
I think you've heard me tell that story before, haven't you?
I have not, actually.
Yeah, I think you cheated. I think you heard it
right,
before.
I sniffed it out. Victory is mine. All right. Thanks, Dave. So you definitely got me a good one. So you and I are both in the writing business, so let's go to our advice column. What's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you, or advice that you overheard?
Okay, I think the best writing advice I've ever gotten, and I pass it along at every opportunity, ignore any rules that don't work for you. There are no actual rules in writing. Whatever works, whatever makes the story work on the page, that's what you do. And anyone who tells you that there are rules against doing something, if it works, it works. That's the best advice I ever got. Ignore rules that don't work. The work will tell you what it needs to be. The worst advice I ever got was in grade school. I had a teacher who, English composition teacher, who insisted that it was some sort of ironclad rule that all paragraphs must contain a minimum of 5 complete sentences. She had a real bone to pick with the notion of sentence fragments. She didn't like single sentence paragraphs as punctuated thoughts. She insisted that if it didn't have 5 complete sentences, it was not a well-constructed paragraph. This, of course, is complete and utter bollocks.
Yes, it is. So, good advice to follow. But Dave, let's go back. And I got a little too excited. So I want you to go back to your Mercedes story in the water balloon. Walk me through it.
All right. I figured the statute of limitations is passed. Why not? It's my freshman year of college at NYU Film School. It's the spring. It's been a long night. We've been up all night. We've been drinking. We're pretty compromised in our judgment at this point. So it's been a Saturday night. Now it's Sunday morning, and the sun is coming up. And we're drunk, and we're out of booze, and we're bored, but nobody wants to go to bed yet. So we come up with an idea. We're up on the 12th floor, and we have balloons. So we fill a balloon with water, and our notion is that we want to get Super 8 film of this balloon falling. We want to track its falling arc, and we want to get the splat when it hits the sidewalk. Now, fortunately, we're in a corner unit at the corner of 5th Avenue and 10th Street in the Rubin dormitory. And because we're in the corner unit, we have windows that look up and down all of 5th Avenue and 10th Street. We can see that there's nobody coming for blocks. There's nobody on the streets. It's like 7:45 in the morning. So there's nobody out here. And we're like, all right, it's clear for 3-4 blocks in every direction. Go for it. It's been raining all night. Let's just release this. So we release the balloon and we're running the Super 8. And the wind coming off the building takes the balloon. Now the balloon starts to drift out toward 5th Avenue, away from the sidewalk, where there are cars waiting at the red light. And we're like, oh, no. Fortunately, the balloon comes back with the air just a little bit at the very end. Instead of smacking into the cab waiting at the red light, it lands on the roof of a Mercedes, a silver Mercedes, parked in front of the dorm. It caves in the roof, causes the glass to explode out away from the car. And of course, the moment we see the impact on the collapsed roof and the glass exploding, it's instant. Ah! You know, it's the guys from Animal House who've just accidentally killed the horse. We slam the windows shut. We close the blinds. We turn off the lights. I go running out of their room. I'm running down 8 flights of stairs, back down to my room. And we wait about 20 minutes. We expect at any moment somebody, cops, dorm security, somebody is going to come knocking on our doors wanting to talk to us about the car. 20 minutes goes by, 30 minutes goes by, no knock on the door. I call up my buddy, I go, anybody come looking for you? No. Anybody come looking for you? No. Should we go down and see what happened? Yeah, why not? All right. So we get up, we meet in the lobby, we go outside. By now a crowd has gathered to look at the exploded Mercedes. The owner is back, he's pissed. The cops are there trying to take a statement, trying to piece together what happened. But the cops are just making this poor guy angrier. Now, sir, I'm just wondering, as I'm looking at you, what? Well, we're just saying, you know, did you maybe have something in your vehicle, maybe an explosive device, perhaps a large animal? What are you talking about, a large animal? Well, there was nothing in my car. Somebody obviously did this to my car. They broke into my car. That's not what we're seeing here, sir. If they broke into your car, what we would expect to see is the glass on the inside of the vehicle. That's not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is the glass on the outside of the vehicle. That seems to suggest that something came out of your car. So we were just curious if you had, no, there was nothing in my car. And he's just losing his shit. Me and my friends go, oh, we should probably get out of here and go get breakfast. Let's blow this scene. So we go back inside and go in the cafeteria and eat our breakfast and forget about it. That was only one car that I destroyed that year, but
well, you'll tell me about that on the next show. All right,
another time.
All right, so we're going to do a question or two, and then we're going to wrap up. So this is a comment for you, Dave. I really enjoyed It's Only a Paper Moon. Vic was such a good character in the DSN world, and we get to see more of Nog and what makes him tick. It really helped to round out Nog. Why a human interest story, or Ferengi in this case, versus a shoot-'em-up episode or big space battle? How different is it creating stories for a universe with a deep space background such as Star Trek? Oh, that's a separate question. Let's start with the first one. Why a human interest story, or Ferengi in this case, versus a shoot-'em-up or episode or a big space battle? This is Deep Space Nine.
Really wasn't up to us. It started out because we were pitching stories around 95. It's Only a Paper Moon was one of the stories we sold, but they didn't know what to do with it right away. So they put it in their hip pocket, and it came back around about 3 years later. At that time, back in the 90s, you could pitch as a freelancer to TV. So one of the things you had to know how to do was to pitch something called a bottle show. And that's when you pitch to a TV show a story that can be shot entirely on the sets they already have standing, using only their regular cast, minimal guest cast, minimal effects, because if they don't have to build any new sets and if they don't have to do any big effect sequences, it saves them a ton of money and a ton of time, which they can then put into the big action-packed episodes that the staff people like to write. So we had pitched a bottle show centered around Quark's Bar. That was the original idea. It was supposed to be like an episode of Cheers, but on DS9.
Right.
and a whole bunch of different storylines threading in and out of the bar. And they liked the idea, but they weren't sure where it fit in. So what happened was, over a period of about 3 years, they'd keep coming back and discussing other ways to approach the material. And eventually what happened was, when they knew they had the episode Siege of AR 558 coming up, and they knew that Nog was going to lose a leg in combat, they saw the potential for this post-trauma episode for Nog, of him doing his therapy, etc., in the holosuite. And they'd spent all this money on the Vic Fontaine Vegas sets, and they wanted to amortize those costs as much as they could over as many episodes as they could. So they said, well, why don't we take this idea, instead of Quarks, we'll shoot most of it on the Vic Fontaine sets, get our money out of those, and we'll do the rest of the story there. And they said, that's great. Okay, bring the original writers back in, have them write a new outline along those lines. So we were brought back in. They said, we're finally buying that thing, but you got to make a few changes. Instead of Quarks, it's Vic's. Instead of this, it's all about Nog and his leg, and this and that, and he's doing his therapy in there, and yada yada. We said, okay, that's great. Why is he doing his therapy in the holosuite? They said, how the hell do we know? It's your story. You tell us. Okay. Finally, we figured it out, that it was all about post-traumatic stress disorder, and I dug into some of my real-life experience where I was badly injured in a car accident when I was 21, and I took my experiences of having to go through physical rehab and learning to walk again, and I gave that trauma and my memory of that trauma to Nog. And fortunately, the actor Aaron Eisenberg, may he rest in peace,
sweet guy,
was someone who had spent his whole life dealing with pain and medical issues, and so he was able to really bring an authenticity to that. That, you know, it was everything you could hope for. And he and Darren Robertson, I think is his name, who played Vic. I could be wrong. I'm probably getting it wrong. But basically, those two guys, it was one of the only times that a pair of recurring characters carried the A story and most of an episode of Star Trek. It was like one of the only times they ever did that.
Yeah, great episode. All right. Thanks, Dave. This was a great show. So we talked about the Shadow Commission. Where can folks get it, and what's next for you?
The Shadow Commission will be available for sale wherever fine books are sold. It's available in trade paperback, ebook formats, and digital audio CD. But for that, you have to get it either from Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or you can order it directly from the audiobook producer Tantor Media. Also coming out the same day, August 11, I have a new Star Trek novel, More Beautiful Than Death, a book that I wrote 10 years ago and which got indefinitely postponed and then resurrected. So you can get those. You can also go to my website, davidmack.pro. That's davidmack, M-A-C-K, .pro. There's links to the books and sales links right there on the front page, and links to my Twitter feed, my Facebook author page, and all that happy hoo-ha. So that's where you can get all that.
All right, Dave, thanks for a great half hour or so. Always great.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a hoot, man.
Loved it. And thanks for everyone who's watching. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro. And since we've been talking about science fiction, fantasy, and intrigue across the cosmos and more, you can check out my new book that's coming out, Crackle on Fire, featuring my hard-boiled private detective, Angela Hardwick, who was hired by our galactic accountant to find a missing intern, and she winds up getting embroiled in a dangerous game of cat and mouse with a madman from Earth who will stop at nothing to get what he wants. It's available through ebook, pre-order now, and it'll be order in paperback and through September through Amazon from Crazy 8 Press. All right, folks, thanks a lot. It was great, and I will see everyone next week.